few ideas sound more tolerant than moral relativism. It tells us that there is no objective moral truth, and rather our definitions of right and wrong are constructed by our personal preferences, history, and the culture for which we grew up in. I mean, who are we to judge? And in a pluralistic and highly globalized landscape, it feels like this is the politically correct stance to take. It avoids arrogance and it avoids moral imperialism. But there is a serious problem. If moral relativism is true, then we actually have no basis to condemn slavery. We can't say that genocide is objectively wrong. And we also can't say that any violations of human rights or literal war crimes are inherently wrong. Rather, we would have to chalk it up to a difference of culture. Today, we are going to be going over why moral relativism actually collapses under its own logic, cannot and does not ground criticism or sustain reform, and ultimately, and in fact, ironically, it actually undermines the very tolerance that it seeks out to protect. Moral relativism comes in two main forms. The first being cultural relativism, that moral truth is determined by cultural norms, and the second being individual relativism, that moral truth is determined by personal belief. The origins trace back to thinkers like Franz Boas, who argued that moral systems must be understood within cultural contexts. Later, philosophers such as Gilbert Harman and Richard Rorty challenged the idea of objective moral facts. Relativism, rather, makes three core claims: that there are no independent moral truths, moral judgments are expressions of cultural or personal frameworks, and therefore no culture can claim moral superiority over another. This position, at first glance, can appear logically succinct. It definitely avoids dogmatism. However, the appearance of logical reasoning does not necessitate actual logical reasoning. Relativism makes a moral claim, and that is that there is no universal moral truths. However, that statement in itself is presented as universally true. So before we dive into the actual logic of this framework, you can already see that there are some really big inconsistencies when it comes to moral relativism. But let's do a more charitable analysis of the statement that there are no universal truths. Let's say that instead of that being a universal truth, let's say it's only relatively true. That being that it applies for some cultures, but not for others. And in that case, a culture that does believe in objective morality can still exist under this framework. However, in both cases, relativism cannot consistently deny an objective morality without implicitly asserting one. Philosopher Plato identified this structure long ago in his debates about relativism in Theaetetus. All beliefs are equally valid relative to perspective, then the belief that relativism is false also has to be valid. So you can see that the position of relativism actually collapses on itself. Relativism also undermines itself when it's confronted with moral progress. If morality is defined by culture, then those that are reformers or activists are always wrong up until the point that culture itself changes. Consider the example of abolitionists in slaveholding societies. If morality is culturally bound, then slavery itself is morally correct in the societies that accepted it. And in fact, it's the activists and the reformers who are socially deviant. But yet we don't describe it that way. We consider the reformers and the activists that pushed to have the civil rights movement as correct, and in fact, they're societies who are the morally deviant ones. And I think that the reason that we do this is because we can all acknowledge and accept that slavery is wrong regardless of if the society accepts it or not. And the fact that we can all recognize that slavery is objectively wrong actually presupposes a judgment that there is a standard beyond just cultural consensus. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, who is often associated with moral critique, did not defend simple relativism. He attacked moral systems but did not claim all values were equally justified. Relativism actually erases the idea of moral progress, because under relativism, morality is defined largely and exclusively, in fact, only by the culture that upholds it. So therefore, there can't possibly be any progress. It's almost like a cycle that just resets. Without having any sort of objective standards, history is not a movement towards justice and equality, rather it is just the transition between preferences. Modern international law actually rests on universal moral claims. The United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It asserts that certain rights apply to all humans. But if moral relativism is correct, then those claims are illegitimate. And under that standard, human rights would be considered Western preferences and not universal truths. Here's a dilemma with relativism. If another nation is systematically torturing their citizens. Can we say that that's objectively wrong or even wrong at all? Or can we only say that we just personally dislike it? Relativism forces a dichotomy in which we can only choose one of two options. Either moral condemnation is meaningless across cultures, or that we secretly rely on universal standards while denying them. Personally, I think the second option is what most relativists actually do. But let me know in the comments below, do you feel like it is this dichotomy that I just described, or do you think that there are other options for which I'm just not considering? I would love to expand my horizons if I have missed anything. However, I really don't think that you can have both things at the same time. It's really interesting because relativism actually does invoke equality, harm prevention, and tolerance. However, all of which function as universal norms. So while they claim to be against objectivity, relativism actually does smuggle in universal truths. However, they're more underlying to the framework and not explicitly stated. Relativism is oftentimes defended as the philosophy of tolerance, but tolerance isn't neutral by any means. It actually functions as a moral value. If all moral systems were equally valid, then intolerance would be equally valid within cultures that endorse it. A society that believes dissenters should be silenced would be morally justified by its own standards. But relativism doesn't provide any sort of ground to challenge those harms. And true tolerance actually requires saying that certain harms are equally bad everywhere. I want to be clear that rejecting relativism does not necessitate that you have to believe in absolutism. That is, that everything is either black or white. You can still defend objective moral principles while acknowledging that there is going to be cultural variation. I don't think that this makes it logically inconsistent by any means. Philosophers such as Immanuel Kant argued for universal moral duties grounded in rational consistency. Contemporary moral realists like Derek Parfait defended the existence of objective moral reasons without appealing to tradition or religion. Objective morality doesn't necessitate having a very rigid or uniform description of what moral principles actually are. But it does mean that some actions like torture, enslavement, or genocide are wrong regardless of cultural endorsement. And that is fundamentally the basis of moral critique. But I would love to hear from you guys in the comments below if you are or previously were a relativist. Did this video change your mind, or are you still firm set in your belief system, and why? And on the other hand, if you are more of a moral absolutist, what are principles that you think can be applied readily to everybody in every situation? Because of course, moral absolutism doesn't really give a lot of rise for context-dependent situations. And finally, if you have a different moral framework, I would love to hear about it again in the comments below. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. I post new videos every Tuesday and Friday. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.